One. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a technically returning good brother to the temple, coming to us from the wonderful world of the Fluxverse, I guess I'll have to call it.
Yeah.
Previously on here for Flux Fantasy, now coming on here for the Volume 1 of the attempt to bring it into a manga-adjacent form with Flux Destiny. The one and only, the artist formerly known as Chris, RC Helix. I told you I was going to get that joke out of my system.
First, it is always a pleasure being in the temple, and I have always been respectfully sitting in the back with the hood over my head, and I now coming on today's the first time that on another platform I'm using my new name. So thank you for doing that. It's funny because when I was when I was choosing, I spent several weeks like, okay, what is my new like artist name? And I was like, I'm not gonna have like multiple ones. Like if this is it. So whatever it is, this is it. So
You're not
we
gonna do
use the
some Black Sabbath / Heaven and Hell kind of thing.
no, and there's gonna be no like Prince symbol or anything. I was like, this is it. Okay. So
Yeah, I had to get the Prince joke out of my system because, well, Minnesota.
of course, absolutely. I would have I think I would have lost a little respect for you if you hadn't brought that joke up. So I was waiting for it. I was prepared.
So, now, obviously, I'm coming at this originally with the whole thing with Flux Fantasy, which has already been well covered, and I'm pretty sure when a sufficient enough update comes along, I'll end up doing a follow up, as mentioned. But there's a lot of the origin story with Flux. We kind of went into when I interviewed you the first time in regards to at the time I was using that as a lead-in for Flux Fantasy, but there's a couple things that I brought up in that I wanted to get some feedback on. During the Valley of the Judge, I mentioned several times that the amount of detail with the Karmistry system as a magic system, for one reason or another, I kept getting reminded of the way alchemy is treated in Full Metal Alchemist. And I'm wondering if that was one of the inspirations or if that was me reading into a coincidence.
Oh no, I mean it's absolutely one of many inspirations, and I think the difference, though, there's a big difference between karmistry and alchemy, in that while there's some things that like on the surface may look similar, they're actually fundamentally very different, because alchemy requires goes, because of equivalent exchange, requires in theory, right, like the use of certain amount of matter or whatever ends up being the end product. You don't normally have a consequence, except if you're doing human transmutation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That comes out of that. Payback is, karmistry is actually very different, where you can do, in fact, alchemy could be a subset of karmistry, because in the Flux Destiny universe,
mm-hmm.
Karmistry, what sets it apart is that instead of it being cost-based, it's consequence-based. And so you have to be very careful when you're using it, because you have to be very skilled, and that's why we call the main practitioners of Karmistry escape artists, because they have to be skilled to be able to avoid and plan and avoid payback that comes with utilizing karma to perform Karmistry. So absolutely, a lot of the big, just famous magic systems were all inspirations for me. Bending is another great one. I think that's probably one that inspires a lot of people too. Alchemy. There's just what I loved about it was that it was very distinct for the Full Metal Alchemist world, right? Is that alchemy may have Arakawa took alchemy, which we'd all learned about in school, and turned it into this magic system for her universe that was really unique. And I would argue that Full Metal Alchemist owns the concept of alchemy, so to speak, because people associate it with it. And I wanted to create a unique magic system for Flux Destiny that was its own, and that when you heard it, you thought of Flux Destiny.
Yeah.
And so going back, the idea was like, well, how can I take something like Destiny and Karma and make these real things? And so, that's kind of how that came about. But it took a while. It took many years to get to the point, even to naming it.
Mm-hmm. And I will clarify something. When I was drawing that parallel, it was more out of the fact that this one magic system serves to reinforce the themes of the greater narrative. Like a lot of, and that's the reason why I brought up alchemy specifically, because beyond just being a magic system, it is that magic system feeds off into a lot of the world, including the narratives within it. Um,
That is so. I'm so glad you said that, because that's something that I neglected to mention earlier when I was talking about. I thought you were talking about just like the practical nuts and bolts, but from the thematic, I loved how alchemy played a thematic role in Full Metal Alchemist, and it's the same here. This universe is very much about, you know, consequence of one's actions, and also understanding that you are part of something bigger. That's where the great machine comes in, right? Where everyone's connected, and using karmistry to change the natural order, which is called destiny in this world. You are imposing. You're not working with. You're not going with the flow, so to speak, right? Like you're like, I'm going to force my will upon things, and so it's very, very. I'm so glad you said that, because there was two sides of it. There was the mechanical aspect of it, and then there was a thematic aspect of it, and that's where it also plays within the narrative. The characters, you've got Hugo and Marco, these teenagers who are learning to use karmistry, and they've got these big plans to be great escape artists one day, and they've got to deal with their egos as part of it, and they have to go through their own character growth and their own, journey during this period to learn, not only the responsibilities of that, but is it right to use these powers?
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, there's been plenty of cases throughout fiction of this sort of theming thing, and this is where I'd want to ask a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Was it a case where you ended up writing the world of Fortuna first, or was it a case where you ended up writing the karmistry system first?
So it started out actually started with the characters first, and this was over a development of many years, but it started with the characters. Then the world started to emerge, but then when I came to the realization when I came to the clarity of vision that I wanted the world to have a well-defined magic system that was also thematic, that would thematically serve the narrative. That then came next, and then they developed together, because as I was developing karmistry and what it did, it also had an impact on the universe around it, right? So Fortuna itself, it spawned the concept of Flux Destinies. That also had an impact on Fortuna as a country and other countries in the Flux Destiny universe. So it started that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, something else I kind of hinted at, especially in one of my more favored rants during the Valley, was the decision to set this in a kind of alternate 90s Americana, which as I kind of hinted at during Valley, I found that to be a very interesting and a very deliberate choice, especially when everybody has these massive boners for doing fantasy 80s.
Right.
Which, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of stuff within the 80s that I enjoy, but I've been critical of that because I felt that a lot of people were hyper focusing on that, sometimes to the point of burying the 90s. And as somebody who came into my love of Puro through the 4 Pillars of Heaven, I can't do that.
Right.
Same thing goes with a lot of the OVA anime that really took its hold in the 90s. If you're not familiar, the 4 Pillars of Heaven were the big 4 in all Japan. Some of them moving on to Noah during the Exodus in 2000. And Japanese pro wrestling is an interesting beast. There's always been far more of a sport focus with it. But like I said, going with this alternate '90s was an interesting and a deliberate choice. And I'm curious what made you want to go with the '90s as part of an aesthetic.
So I'm really glad you brought up that question because it was absolutely deliberate, and it started down this path. And I think a lot of people, and I could be generalizing, but I think a lot of people who want to create something that is fantasy of some sort, right? Some sort of fantasy magic something, right? Will a lot of times default to something that's high fantasy or something that's medieval, something of that nature, right? Or steampunk or whatever. And there have been so many that have done that well, right? And there's also, when you mention the 80s almost became memed, right? Where everyone was doing and almost comical because I kept seeing, there were some great adaptations of the 80s, representations of the 80s in popular media. But sometimes you'll see it where it's almost caricatured to the point of like, I was a kid then and
The
no.
Dana Carvey effect, I call it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
For those who don't, for those not in the know and why I call it that, Dana Carvey had at one point in an interview had talked about how his George H.W. Bush impression on Saturday Night Live started out fairly on point, but after about a year or so, he had done it so many times that it became this impression of an impression of an impression, and didn't represent the at the time.
It was nothing like George Bush by the time it was done. It was just so over the top and so comical, but it was just like it wasn't him anymore, right? But it was him, but not like you said, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy, and it was funny in and of itself, but it wasn't him. And that's kind of the same thing that I've seen. And so because when I chose the 90s was a couple reasons. One is that I wanted the magic. First, I wanted to create a universe. There's several criteria that went into why I chose that. First was that I wanted to create a world that was relatable, so that it was relatable in that it felt like our world, because it would make the magic stand out, right? If you had a Flux Destiny or performed Karmistry in our world right now, that would be pretty amazing, right? Like to see someone do that. At the same time, I wanted to pick the 90s because technology was still at that kind of tipping point where the internet started coming, you started being able to send email and stuff, but still people, cell phones were still kind of rare. People still did normal things. Social media didn't exist yet. There was a very special, like that world was so different than our world today.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of that stuff can be distracting. And also it creates, it takes a lot of the challenges out of the way in the storytelling because you could instantly send information, via email or text or whatever. I wanted something that reminded me when I was a kid, the world felt so much bigger. And so I wanted that feeling. And finally, because these characters, Hugo and Marco, are going through this coming of age journey, I wanted to kind of capture how I felt when I was a teenager growing up. And I wanted to live that through here. So it captures all those reasons. That's why I chose the 90s, was that it's like, imagine an alternate universe Earth where this is possible, this particular kind of, we call it, it's not really magic, it's more of a science. It's just easier to call it a magic system, but that people are capable of doing this. And, there's certain things like, when I look at like the Las Vegas sphere, for example, I was like, that would be an example of a Flux Destiny, for example, right? Someone could use Karmistry to do that, if it wasn't technology based. So anyway, I'm kind of going on and on about it, but it was very deliberate, and I'm so glad you asked that question because it was a very deliberate choice to do that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to display my own version of the 90s through it.
And I realized that a lot of people, especially like film buffs and sometimes music buffs, end up romanticizing that particular period when it comes to the 80s. But again, it's something that through overexposure has become something of a parody. And what makes it even more so is a lot of people propping up the 80s at the 90s expense. And
Yes.
this is why I brought up things like the Four Pillars of Heaven. A lot of them really came. The Four Pillars of Heaven, as they're referred, really got their start throughout the 90s, as well as one infamous promotion when it came to the whole Japanese deathmatch scene, and that was Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, or FMW. Which when most people think of hardcore matches in wrestling, they think of the tables, the chairs, the sometimes the light tubes, all of that. That is tame compared to what Japan was doing in the 90s, where you're dealing with freaking piranhas and exploding barbed wire. I'm not kidding about either of those. Those were used in matches. The kind of stuff that one would expect to see in like an episode of Baki the Grappler. Of course on the music end, you had a lot of people very viscerally reacting to the embarrassment that was the whole Milli Vanilli incident, to the point
Oh
that
my God!
yeah. For most of my life, that whole thing was used as a running joke because of how embarrassing that was.
That was so embarrassing. In fact, I remember recently. I totally forgot about this, but when what's her name? Remember Ashley Simpson when that happened to her on SNL? I saw that pop up recently, and I had totally forgotten about Milli Vanilli until that came up, and I remember what a embarrassing scandal that was.
Yeah, I know that indirectly that ended up killing off the baggy scene or in Manchester, which also known as the Manchester scene. I imagine that was part of the reason why the whole Unplugged thing became such a massive deal. Taking various artists at the time and having them go acoustic for a show.
Right.
Everything always has some sort of reaction. I'd say that was the case there. But for me personally, it was a mix of both that as well as a concept that I've wanted to see explored, and I haven't seen enough people do. Like, there's been the idea of modern magic, but the idea of magic of a certain magic or magic system just being a established part of the culture, the same way like the internet is for modern culture. I jokingly said I wanted to see a fantasy setting that jumps ahead about 6 generations to modern tech, but the traditions still are there. And there is something of that, and I'm curious if even before you started writing like the webtoon, if you had been writing a series Bible beforehand.
Absolutely, there is so much. So there's so much that the regular fans don't see, because we have actually an internal wiki with like hundreds and hundreds of pages. This has been developed over many years to get to this point, and every character has their own entry in our internal wiki that's not public, where I've developed all the individual characters, all the story threads, everything about all these locations, everything. There's a lot of spoiler material, obviously, so that's why it's not public yet. And so all that was carefully created because one of a 4-letter word for me is retcon. And I know that they can't always be avoided, but for me, I love stories and universes where things are purposeful, that the author meant what they were doing, And so I decided that I was going to go on this long multi-year pre-production journey, because I wanted, when you see something show up in Flux Destiny, it's not there by coincidence. But pretty much every decision was deliberate, just like you asked about the 90s. Even the Fortuna, the country, which is based on the United States at that time, is a deliberate choice, because I wanted to have this atmosphere of the time. The U.S. was perceived as a very different place there at that time. and I wanted to have that kind of energy around it. Everything from, certain name choices to locations, or why things are set up a certain way, they all have deliberate reason. They've been deliberately put in that way.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned earlier, for example, like bringing magic into the modern day and kind of bringing those customs, while not all of that is present here, I wanted it to almost be feel that way, where karmistry is amazing, but it's almost at the same time it's like electricity, or like it's almost as mundane as that too, where it powers modern technology, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm not sure if mundane is the right word, but I'd say integrated.
Yes, that's a better word. That's a much better word.
Mundane and comes off a bit reductionist, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think it's better to say it's magic amongst the mundane, where the world is it's kind of like our mundane world that we are familiar with, and that's why there's that setting. If you were to do karmistry in the setting of any, think of the most high fantasy like setting you can think of, or like a cliche like Final Fantasy world, like any one that people think of, the magic doesn't stand out because everything is spectacular, and so I wanted to create a canvas that was more familiar, so that when karmistry is used, it's way more spectacular in that setting.
And with that in mind, when it comes to it, one of the things that I find interesting with it is obviously presenting this as a manga. So would it be fair to say that if you can get a printed version, it's going to be printed in the same page format as like a manga volume?
Yeah, it's actually done at the same. It's done at the same aspect ratio, and it's done exactly the same way. Yeah. I'm hesitant to, I usually call it like manga style or manga inspired, because a lot of the purists would be, for me to call it a manga would be upset because, it's not made in Japan. Like, okay, I get it. That's why I have to kind of call it a graphic novel, because I don't want to run afoul of that, because I've been there before. So
I can understand that, and I'd like to extend a certain message to the purists, and it's the same message I extend to the OSR crowd. In not too many words, kiss my black ass. I was in those debates about what was being referred to as Western anime or American manga, and whether or not they counted. I consider it like this. Since we're dealing with the 90s, let's bring up The Matrix. A lot of the cinematography styles were very much inspired and influenced by John Woo, especially Hard Boiled. Doing away with the whole idea of having someone fire into nothing and then cut to someone getting shot, or cut to an exploding squib or something like that, but having them in the same shot. And yet, if someone does that style of cinematography, there's nothing that says that it's should be owned by Hong Kong.
That's true.
When professional wrestling first made its way into Japan, and then you get the evolution that was Strong Style and King's Road through Inoki and Baba. It's not like there's no hard and fast rule that says you have to be doing a certain style with all the time. I mean, you have the various styles of wrestling all over the planet these days, whether it be lucha libre in Mexico, whether it be strong style, or whether it be the world of sports stuff. And in that same vein, and this is the real important part. This is why I tell them to fuck off. You're at a point where you have a whole generation of creative people who did not get their start through the likes of your Windsor Smiths or your Claremonts or anybody who was doing Golden Age comic book art.
Right.
They may have gotten their inspiration from Araki, who does not age. Seriously, that guy looks the exact same as he did 40 years ago. I don't know how he does it. Or Toriyama, or any of a wide variety of mangaka that I could list. That's how they got into this creative process, and they're going to make stuff that is drawing upon that. So this idea that it has to be from a certain place is, to me, akin to a child holding onto their security blanket, their emotional support teddy bear. And if I sound dismissive on that kind of thing, it's because I kind of am. Because I've seen this kind of purism spiral and where it leads, and I want no part of that.
I agree with you, because the thing is that when I was at Funimation, for example, and we were producing, I mean, this was even worse back then, because when I was producing the anime movies back then, they were being produced in Japan. The animation was being done there. We had Japanese creators. We had the writing may have been done in the U.S. and the production may have been run from here, but
that's not even anything new. Like
exactly.
There are episodes of Batman Batman the Animated Series that were animated by TMS.
Exactly. But you know how it is that I think some people just want to. It's funny because one of the themes in Flux Destiny that emerges as the mainline story starts coming out is about the ego. And I'm a big fan of the philosophies of like Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle, and I've studied a lot about that and about how ego is such a powerful concept that drives a lot of things that human beings do. And there's a lot of crossover with Buddhism, and it's just such a fascinating, and bringing these kind of themes in, people who bring up those kind of fights, purists about manga and is this really a manga or not, this is all fights of the ego. And I look at it was a deliberate choice to do a manga style, because not only did I come from that, from that industry, but the manga has a certain way of being able to deliver really, it has such a variety of it has such a spectrum that it can deliver in terms of like funny, serious, sad, emotional, all these things in just black and white. And there's an elegance and a beauty to that style that when I look at my art style, mine is very much a East meets West in terms of art style, where I obviously have anime influences in my style, but I also grew up with Western animation, so I try to bring the two together into a mix that's kind of uniquely my own.
And there's plenty that do that.
Yeah,
part of the reason that I've been critical of that purism thing is I've seen where that ends up going, and the big example I often bring up to people as far as the end point of that is why, say, sim racing in the video game world is so stagnant and has been for years, because of the fact that there's such a overemphasis on what you're supposed to do or what you're supposed to not do. That no new ideas come along. Everybody's repeating the same set of ideas. Like if I were to show you a screenshot of Assetto Corsa and R Factor 2, you couldn't tell the difference.
Right.
And there's also the whole rockism mindset in music critique ended up dying a death in the 2000s. because it was doing that same thing of acting like classic rock was the true kind of music.
Right.
And it devolved into kind of a boys club. And I'd use boys club in terms of hockey. How some hockey teams end up being complete crap because they're not bringing in new ideas. They're bringing in old faces all the time, and then acting surprised that they're not going anywhere when you're dealing with a sport that is so constantly changing.
Right.
But that's I will note. I remember seeing some of those Western manga or even manhwa, the stuff that was coming out of Korea or Hong Kong, in the manga section in my bookstore. That hasn't changed anytime soon. You go into a bookstore, you're gonna find a big ass manga section. But one of the other things I was a bit curious about, since you said you created the characters first. Did you end up creating Hugo and Marco at the same time, or was it a case of one was created and then the other one was?
They were, it's funny because they were actually created at the exact same time. And they actually started off as these completely, I was doing this so many years ago in the heyday of webcomics when they were first coming out, when webcomics were a thing, when people used to wait a whole week for a page sort of thing. I used to do this webcomic called Cause Effect, and it was about this group of squirrels in a rock band and fighting evil robots and manufactured pop stars, and it was just kind of this like Saturday morning cartoon kind of thing. And I was going to start another, and it actually did really well. And I was like, I want to do another story, but something a little more serious and epic. And it was gonna star like some more, animal characters again. And I go, no, you know what? I want to make some change. I'm going to take these, and I started developing it that way. And I said, I'm going to start converting this to human characters, and I'm going to learn to draw these properly, and I want to develop it based on that. And so I converted those characters to Marco and Hugo, and so they were basically made on the exact same day. And but it's so far removed. If you knew any of the stuff that was developed back then to what it is today, it's not the same thing. Yeah, I'm a big fan of, I don't know if you've read the book Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who was one of the principals at Pixar. But he talks about in that book about ugly babies, nurturing your ugly baby, that when an idea comes out, it's usually, this idea that is, nascent. It's a proto idea. It's got lots of issues, but you keep nurturing it until it gets to the right place. And my philosophy with it was not to accept the first thing that came out of my head, was to keep working on this until I got something that I felt like I could stand behind and go, I developed this with full intention and everything was as deliberate as possible and with thought, and that it wasn't, for the most part, not something that was like accidental. And Hugo and Marco, when they first came out, they were actually, in fact, their personalities were completely flipped when I first came up with them. And so I started a webcomic at the time called Battlegate, and it was actually in a completely different setting. It starred them. They were completely different characters. And that was kind of like the proto idea for it. And that webcomic did really well. And so that was I did like 150 pages of it. It did really well. And then I ended up working at Funimation. And so for many years I was busy, and I worked at these other companies for a while, and I had developed this in the background. So that's kind of the story around it, was that if you saw what was originally, it reminds me of, did you ever see like the, I think you and I might have talked about this when we first met, was any of the original development stuff for Avatar?
I have the art book, and I and I do recall talking with you about this, how some of the with a lot of the concepts that they put into it, there was a series of interesting events that led to it, like the very early concepts. We're going to lean more into science fiction early on.
Yeah, I think it
I
was
mean,
going to take place in space or something.
it was going to take place on this ice planet with with two sides, one that manipulates the ice, one that manipulates fire. And the main reason the martial arts thing got integrated in what would eventually become bending was because I think one of the two already was studying kung fu at the time,
Hmm.
and it was just suggested to integrate that. Um, and the big reason they weaned off away from the sci-fi stuff is a lot of the people who were involved had come off of animating Invader Zim, and they weren't as keen on doing sci-fi again. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so it was just this gradual shift,
And
and
see that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
even some of the stuff that they did in the actual show were either happy accidents or things that they were doing as kind of in jokes, like the Julie character during the whole Bossing Say arc. That was them taking the piss out of the Nickelodeon representative,
Right.
or the Swordmaster episode where Aang has that ridiculous armor on. That was
Right.
them
Yeah.
making fun of the toy division because the toy division would kept sending them these over designed, these over complicated and ridiculous toy concepts, and they kept rejecting them.
Right.
Um, and when I say happy accidents, one of the big one in that sense is Sokka. Like Sokka was made a bit of the comic relief on accident. That wasn't the intent. The intent was for him to be the smart guy, but his voice actor had an improv background and would just ad lib lines, so they just made it part of his character.
And see, I love that part of the development process when that happens. All these things that like that's the part of like the iterative process, right?
Mhm.
Is being okay with throwing away an idea or letting it evolve, and that developing Flux Destiny and everything about it um, was such a long iterative process that there were times Ella hates when I say this, but I like it felt like I have been pregnant for like many years, and it took a long time to finally like, okay, it's coming, right? It's finally coming, and it took a while to get there, but it had to be right. It had to be something that I felt like I could stand behind and in an interview like this answer questions about it confidently.
Mhm.
And uh, I just so I know we've kind of taken a long way around, but yeah, they are they were created at this exact same time. So
Yeah.
bringing it back home,
Mhm.
yes, they were created at the same time.
Yeah, I can get that. And when when it comes to the idea of like clock bots, which obviously that's part of the cast. I am curious if there was a certain point or a certain event that prompted the idea of let's have robotics be part of a thing in this universe.
So there were a couple things that led me to do that. One was I like robots just in general. I think they're cool, and I when I was coming up with a I wanted them to have a companion with them, and I played with all these different ideas. And the idea of Clockbots started as one single character who is Lucky, the Clockbot who's with them, and then expanded into a whole fleet of Clockbots that are available, you know, in this universe. So that's how that came about. But I just I love robots, and I love. I also thought that if I was going to push the alternate 90s universe, because this takes place on an alternate Earth in the 1990s. So this is Earth, it's an alternate Earth. I said I wanted to push it even more because there were a lot of things we were promised when we were kids that, didn't really kind of come to fruition yet. We should have flying. Really, we all should be flying cars right now. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. On one hand, the flying car thing seems nice. On the other hand, if you've seen how people drive,
exactly. You count your blessings, right? Thank God for unanswered prayers, sort of thing.
You've no doubt seen how people in LA drive. You really want that in full 6 degrees of freedom.
Absolutely. So it's like, when I was pushing, when the idea of the clockbots came about, was that, okay, imagine that, but then there's just, the technology is just a little more advanced thanks to Karmistry. And so it allows certain things like clockbots. And you'll discover in the mainline series that the clockbots and their origins and they have very deliberate origins that we'll discover over the course of the story. I get a lot of questions about the clockbots and their origins, et cetera, et cetera. And I always have to kind of dismiss it a bit and go, I can't talk much about it because that's something that's revealed in the story. Marco and Hugo, as they go about is not the right word because that sounds like they're just casually. It's absolutely a very intense story that follows. There's these mysteries that they start unraveling over the course of the story, and all these things are integrated, including the clockbots. So there's a whole history. They're not just there. The only thing I'll say about their significance is that they're not just there to be cool. They serve a part in the deep story of that Marco and Hugo unravel over the course of the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly get that. And speaking of, I remember one of the things you said during the reveal that I found interesting, and that is that you had a whole volumes worth of arts and structure right out of the gate, like structuring out this entire 18-volume series of multiple arcs, which I'd like to say is a common thing, but sometimes it does seem like some creators fly by the seat of their pants regarding what part of the story they're doing next. And I find it interesting that was a deliberate choice to have, not just have it announced that you have it structured, but also put a whole ass chart showing that.
Well, I'm glad I knew if anyone would appreciate that, be you, because a couple things. So I have a couple thoughts on that. So the first thought is that, I don't hold judgment against other creators who haven't been able to do that, because sometimes circumstances don't allow it. Sometimes they'll pick up, a creator who maybe, whether it's a manga creator or comic book or whatever, they may be picked up on the concept alone, and they don't have the luxury of time, right? And they have to develop the world as they go and the story as they go. And so I completely appreciate and understand that. No judgment there, because that's just like, hey, opportunity knocks, you have to answer, right? In my case, because I had the luxury of being able to sit back and develop this fully, I wanted to create a story where I wanted to be able to, when I was making the original webcomics, I was doing that way. When it was Battlegate and these others, I was just kind of going. And I don't find that fun, because for a number of reasons. One, it's like, it's not efficient storytelling. I'm also missing out on a lot of opportunities that the world can deliver on because I'm not planning it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, I'm going to spend this time to develop it. And so if you could see the stuff that I have, if you could see this is something Ella is obviously privy to. She can see we have a whole world timeline, and we have everything. All the major world events are spelled out. We have all the ages of the characters, where they were, even characters that aren't alive in this period. We know where they were and what they were doing. And all that was when I wanted to create the narrative itself. I then said I have to develop all the arcs and develop all how they're connected and how they build up to the climax, how they get there. Because you're building up to this climax during the whole story, and for that climax to be really impactful, all those threads have to be really thought out so that they contribute to it, so that when you're on the precipice of the climax, you're looking back and going, holy crap, that like all this was meant to happen. Like this is all leading to this. It wasn't by coincidence. And because I had the luxury to plan it out over that period, you know, and you can get to a point where you have to be careful because you can overplan, right? And it'll never happen. So I had to get to a point where I go, okay, I've done enough. It's ready to go, you know? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to show that when we were launching the Kickstarter, because I wanted the people who were going to back us, not only our own fans, which many of them knew it anyway because they've been following me developing this for some time, but anyone new coming into the universe could see that this was not just, hey, I'm going to do a graphic novel. No, this is the narrative foundation of the whole universe. Flux Fantasy, the RPG, is based on the premise of this story and this universe. And it's a serious business. This is our trilogy, you know, and it's over multiple books, but this is like our, you know, our mainline story. So I wanted to show that this was not just me, you know, I'm going to just go tell a story. No, anyone that was going to invest in the Kickstarter, I wanted them to know that I took this seriously. Mm-hmm. That this was a project that I took very much to heart, and that their money was going to something to help push something that was deeply cared for and deliberate, and not just, hey, fund my creative adventure. Yeah. You know, because I'm going to do it regardless. I'm doing it anyway. The Kickstarter just helps me tell it faster. Mm-hmm. You know, because I can bring on some assistants to help me to do some of the finishing work. You know.
Yeah. And then, I don't want to delve too much into Flux Fantasy, obviously, because I already did that. But
right, and quite deep and quite well, thank you. So,
but that relationship does bring a certain thing into perspective, because this is something that, and I'm not trying to throw shade. If anyone gets mad at my takes, I'll just say, I hold these truths to be self-evident that all are cremated equal. I need to give a bit of background for this. So a while back, I gave my impressions on Avatar Legends, and I did not care for it. And part of the reason I did not care for it, and this may sound a bit odd, but I'm going somewhere with this. I felt that what it was trying to replicate was not what it should have. Mm-hmm. It was billing itself as role-playing within the TV show. What it should have been doing is presenting the stories you could tell within the world of Four Elements.
Right.
In the same vein, if somebody's picking up a Marvel TTRPG, like Marvel Phase Rip back in the day, or Marvel Multiverse nowadays, they don't want to be playing as one of the X-Men. They might want to play as a student they've created who happens to live in the Xavier Institute, but they don't want to play as Cyclops or as Storm or anybody like that. This is something that Marvel Phase Rip ended up learning the hard way back in the 70s. So when people can't figure that out now, I have to call that out. And by building an RPG, a associated RPG, you end up dodging that problem. Because there wasn't this assumption that you're just playing the story that you've already written for the comic.
Right. And that, like, purposefully, when you read the core rulebook, for example, I think maybe Hugo's name is mentioned maybe twice in the whole thing. We were very deliberate
in chapter 1.
Yeah, I think so, because it was only, and the only reason for that was to anchor it, to make sure that it was fully anchored, that people knew that, hey, by the way, this happens to be the same universe and time that the main characters go through, and you can have your own adventures in the, like, I wanted, this goes back to the authenticity part where it's like, I wanted it not to be some like licensed spin-off that's like, oh, hey, here's Flux Destiny's RPG and it's just kind of like a gimmick. No, is that you are playing, I wanted to create a basis for a universe that people could create their characters and stories within the framework that I've provided for them. And it so happens that it's the same framework that was used to tell the main story. And so I like what you're talking about. Like I actually about Avatar Legends, I know exactly what you mean about that, because I didn't want this to be, hey, go play as Hugo in. Actually, I have to fight Ella a lot about Hugo in the RPG because anytime I wanted to even do like when we would do actual plays, she'd be like, Chris, she goes, you're gonna bring you're gonna bring Hugo into this, and she goes, you're gonna screw around with the timeline and and just let him be who he is. And I respect that. I understand what she's doing with it. And I wanted it to not be, it needs to stand on its own. The RPG has to stand on its own, and people need to feel free to tell stories that are unencumbered by the main story, And if they want to tell stories that happen to dovetail on the main story or whatever, awesome, go for it. In fact, the Kickstarter, Ella's writing a one-shot that is one of the rewards of the Kickstarter, where you can go with Marco and Hugo when they're attending Karmistry Academy Wolfgang, and you have to uncover there's a secret that gets that they come across, and there's like this group of people. I don't want to like spoil too much about it, but to spoil her story, but it's you can go and have them part of your party, but that's not a requisite of playing this game, and it's not required that you play it as if you are playing the mainline story. All that's important is that you recognize there's the magic system of Karmistry, how it fits into the universe, and certain laws and regulations if you're going to play in Fortuna. I again, I don't want to, I'm not at a risk of like going on a tangent. I'll just say this last thing about the RPG is that as we go through the mainline story, we'll also be introducing other elements within the RPG, such as, other countries and other factions and things like that will come into the RPG that you can play in. So anyway, I'm glad you actually said that, because it was very, again, a very deliberate decision when we were designing the RPG.
And I do, although there is one other thing within the world that I did want to dip into, because you had brought it up a bit during one of the episodes of the Valley, and that's Lucky 888. Because it being this in-universe thing and the impact that it has, I was tempted to make kind of a joke about the way some people treat like Whataburger down in Texas or In-N-Out on the West Coast. It felt like it was in
right.
Just with a noodle shop instead of a burger joint. But I think maybe it's because I was in like a very foodie central kind of neighborhood, in one of the many neighborhoods I was in. But was the intent with Lucky 888 to kind of channel that one dive that everybody in the neighborhood knows in some regard?
The answer to that is yes, and that. So there's a thematic version. I have to be cagey about this answer because the noodle shop also plays a role in the main story. But I can answer the first part, which is what you said is yes. It was to, we used to hang out at Whataburger all the time when I was a kid. We would go, there was those places that you would go, and sometimes the food was like, Whataburger was okay. I like Whataburger, but there's, it's American. There's nothing more American than fast food, and part of creating the environment of Fortuna, which is the stand-in for the United States, was to provide things like that there's nothing more American in the United States than fast food, rock and roll, highways, all that kind of stuff. And so being able to create the ambiance of this universe, the noodle shop is one of those elements. So in addition to being something narrative that I can't say more about right now, but
yeah, and obviously the bigger story parts I didn't want to focus on with that, but when I look at the impact that place has within the characters of the world, I get reminded of certain places like the malt shop or Porky's down in Snelling, and I'm getting very much into the deep lore of the Twin Cities in the 90s. But and no, I'm not referring to the Porky's of the movie of the same name. Everybody makes that mistake, but that was one of the big drive-in kind of places. Yes, even in the 90s, those were still a thing in some places.
They were even in Beaumont, Texas, where I grew up. There was a Porky's there, I think. I think it had closed, but
and the malt shop wasn't a drive-in, but it was a malt place. And obviously, if I'm talking Twin Cities and that kind of thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Mickey's Diner Car, which if you saw certain movies back then, you have seen that thing, especially if you were watching like Mighty Ducks as a little kid.
Yeah.
Like, it is the place that looks like a diner car. Everybody knows it in some form or another because it was all over the place. Those kind of places. The kind of thing that Guy Fieri would highlight nowadays.
Right. That's right.
Now, what are you shooting for as far as a page count for Volume 1?
So Volume 1 is going to be about 220 pages. Volume 1, and each volume is going to be about the same. My plan is if I can reach the stretch goals, I'll be able to release. The ultimate plan is to release 2 volumes a year. That's a lot of work, but if I have the help, I can do it. I just need the help to do the finishing work, but I do all the drawing and everything else with it. I just need help with the screen toning and everything, and we could get really far with it. So my original plan was this was going to be written like prose novels, and then when I had converted it to going back to a graphic novel, 18 novels sounds like a lot, but that's really in line with typical manga. It's a little shorter than like manga stories that are kind of epic in nature. And if I can do with the proper help, I could be doing about 2 of these a year at least. We could 2 and a third. We could finish the whole series within 7 years by that point, which is how long it was going to take to develop. To write and finish the prose novels too. I was going to release 1 book a year. So that's the math behind it.
Yeah, I could certainly see it, and I'll definitely be looking forward to seeing how it develops. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and braving. I was gonna say braving time zone hell, but you and I aren't in the same relative time zone, so that's not a case. But obviously, heading all the way up the mountain to my temple. And enjoying the madness that happens around here.
Well, Monk, I gotta thank you. I appreciate you letting me come here and talk about this and asking me these questions. There's nothing a creator loves more than those kind of questions, and I just deeply appreciate you bringing me back to the temple to talk to your fans and being able to share this. It means a lot to me, and I'm so glad that we've. I appreciated you backing the Kickstarter too. I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
Every little bit helps, and that meant a lot to me. You doing that, and we were so blown away by the performance of it, like I said, within 24 hours, we had hit our main goal.
Mm-hmm.
And we were just, we had received so many just awesome messages from people who were excited to see this go. And, having your support on the Kickstarter and you bringing me on here, I just deeply appreciate. So I just want to tell you that.
Yeah. And I know some might argue that there's some conflict of interest of me bringing people on for Kickstarters that I've backed. I see it as a couple things. One, a lot of the Kickstarters I back are with small, sometimes one-man projects. And more importantly, it is me demonstrating that I am putting my money where my mouth is. Like, everybody talks about how we need to support alternatives, but when it comes time to put up or shut up, they're nowhere to be found. And you got an APB out looking for them.
And you've made that clear from the very beginning about shining the light on these kind of projects. So I don't see it as a conflict of interest. In fact, I see it as something like, hey, you saw something, you believed in it, and you want to highlight it. Even when we were doing the Flux Fantasy Valley series, you were very objective during that period. You praised what you liked, and you highlighted things that you're like, hey, I would do this, and we took notes.
Mm-hmm.
And version 1 of the RPG that has the advanced mechanics comes out in is it December? No, it's in November. I can't remember now when we've got several things happening. So it's either November or December. I think it's December. That is when it comes out. And it's going to have all the, a lot of the notes that you had given during the Valley series, we integrated in. Mm-hmm. It's going to have the advanced mechanics and everything. But, you were very objective and very fair with it, praising what you liked and saying, hey, this is what I would change. Mm-hmm. And so we deeply appreciated that.
Yeah. And of course, a sincere thanks goes to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.